So this is one of those videos that I have been really wondering how I should do. So much so it's actually delayed my recording of videos. I'm actually behind this week because I have done 5 different attempts to record this video. 5 different attempts to record a Royal Navy's opinion on leadership at Coral Sea, Midway and Leyte Gulf. And, well, this is a video which has been suggested and requested. It's been suggested and requested. It's not just a random topic I'm bringing up myself, it's actually a suggested, requested video. And how do I do this? How do I do this properly? Well, as you've probably realised, my shameless book plug has come rather early in the slides. Come rather early, so I say thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing, helping the channel grow and all that, because realistically this is going to go away and we are going to change to this, and I'm going to talk to you about this book. This is The Great Naval Battles of the Pacific War, the official Admiralty accounts of Midway, Coral Sea, Java Sea, Guadalcanal and Leyte Gulf, compiled by John Graham. And every time I try to do PowerPoints or things for this, it didn't seem proper. It didn't seem correct. It's kind of interesting, though, to talk about it from this perspective, to look at these the documents in here. And, okay, yes, these are transcripts of the documents. These are the documents that have been compiled together by John Graham. But it's worthwhile reading. It's worthwhile considering. Because it's the closest for many people they can get to the documents. They don't get the time to go to the archives. They don't get to do what I do, which is spend hours and hours in archives and days upon days. Most people don't get that ability. So these books, like this, and like the Britannia series, which if I have about half of, actually no, 3, 6, 9, I have about 12 sitting here next to me. Things like this are where you can get to the archives. You can get at least to the UK archives. Now going to them, there are American equivalents. And I found it quite an interesting question to be approached with, because you know, we're often talking about the USN's opinions on what the Royal Navy was up to. It's rather interesting to turn it on the head and go, what does the Royal Navy think about what the US Navy was up to? And their leadership. Because they're the 2 largest navies in the world. They are the 2 largest navies in the world. They are the 2 dealing with the most issues going on in the world. You know, one is basically fighting the Battle of Atlantic. There are others being part of it, but, you know, the Royal Canadian Navy is actually more involved in the Battle of Atlantic than the US Navy, because for the US Navy, honestly, they have other things which are more pressing for them. When the world gets divided up between the Royal Navy and the US Navy, there's pretty much options of, right, and we know you're building a 2-ocean Navy, but you need all that Navy to deal with the Japanese right now. That's fine, so you take the Pacific, we'll take the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean. Because we're dealing with the Italians and the Germans, and we're going to take the lead in dealing with that, and you're dealing with the Japanese. And that relates to it. That makes sense. And yes, the Americans supply some forces into the Atlantic, and the British supply some of the forces into the Pacific. HMS Victorious, aka USS Robin. And all these things. They share resources when they need to, because they're allied fleets. But functionally, they divide the world up in half and go, right, you take one side, we'll take the other. And it works. It works. But that doesn't mean they're ignoring what the other one is up to. In fact, they're constantly studying and looking at what the other is up to, because they're the best ones for them to learn from, often. And so this particular book has the Coral Sea, it has Midway, and it has Leyte Gulf in it. It also has Guadalcanal and the Java Sea, but if I get into all of these topics and do all of them, then frankly, I will probably never finish. This is one of the problems. Most of the time when I noticed I was doing with the other books, well no, with the topic when I was doing the other recordings, I was basically talking out of this anyway. And I went, in the end, let's just do a talking of what they're actually saying and then discussing it. And the best way to do it, especially in this medium, is to talk it through. Displaying it on screen is great, and there will be points where I will be pointing at the screen, but realistically, that's not as helpful as talking it through. And considering the sheer amount of people I have who seem to use my videos as podcasts, I thought I'd do one which was a sort of podcast-focused video. So, let's start off with page 9 and the action at Tulugi on the 4th of May 1942. US intelligence reports indicated that a Japanese airborne attack on Port Moresby might occur in the first week of May, and the concentrations of the available Allied forces in the Coral Sea, Task Forces 17, 11, 16, and the Australian squadron to oppose it was accordingly ordered. Task Force 11 had left Pearl Harbor on the 16th of April for Christmas Island. It was now diverted to the Coral Sea, where the Australian squadron was also to join up. Task Force 16 at Pearl Harbor was unable, in the event, to arrive before the battle was joined. Task Forces 17 and 11 made rendezvous, as arranged, at 05:45 on the 1st of May in latitude 16 degrees south, 162 degrees 20 east, and some 300 miles west of the New Hebrides. Two of the three oilers used for servicing the fleet, the Neosho and Tippecanoe, were in the area. Rear Admiral Fletcher directed the Rear Admiral Fitch to meet the Tippecanoe with her escort, the Chicago and Perkins, in latitude 16 degrees south, longitude 161 degrees 43 east, and fuel steering to rejoin Task Force 17 next morning. The intention being to retain the Neosho as a reserve and to send the Tippecanoe back empty to Afante, the New Hebrides, for relief stocking. Task Force 17 completed refueling from the Neosho on the 2nd of May, but Rear Admiral Fitch reported that he did not expect to finish until noon on the 4th. With enemy action now reported imminent, Commander Task Force 17 could not contemplate remaining so far to the southeastward. He set course to the northwestward, directing the Rear Admiral Fitch to refuel his destroyers if practical at night, on the same course, and rejoined Task Force 17 at daylight on 4th of May in latitude 15 degrees south, longitude 157 degrees east, the position in which Rear Admiral Case had been directed to rendezvous with the Australia and Hobart from Australia. That's all seeming rather sensible. And basically, most of this account is literally detailed information like that. That is what the British are doing. They have a full, detailed line out of timings and what went on. This was a contemporaneous document this comes from. What the British were putting together from the information they were receiving from the Americans to analyse it. But then you find their own analysis, and what I find interesting is what they are focusing in on. Because what they're focusing in on, it tells you a lot about what they're thinking. That's often how we track analysis of people. What information are they selecting to talk about? What information are they selecting to analyse? How are they organising that analysis? Logistics is coming through a lot here. The British have had plans for their own logistics. They at this point are trying to rebuild their logistics after Winston Churchill had the bright idea of converting their fast fleet oilers into amphibious ships carrying a load of landing craft on them. He had so many bright ideas in the early months of the war as his return as First Lord of the Admiralty, sorry. Just so annoying, but you know. Some of them get done, some of them don't get done. Life happens. One of the interesting things that comes through after the Battle of the Coral Sea, though, is this information is put in, and it's attached to the Royal Navy's arguing for we need to rebuild our fast tanker arm. We need to rebuild it. We need to recapitalise our fast tankers. The trouble is, it's easier to say than do at that point, because tankers are kind of in demand, and building fast tankers, as useful as they would be for naval operations, means you're not building tankers for the Atlantic crossings and the various duties of tankers moving around the Indian Ocean and various other parts of the world. And that's a problem for the Royal Navy, because they need tankers for doing both things. You know, Admiral Henderson, who was the Third Sea Lord prior to World War II, had been carefully trying to build up the fast tankers, and his careful force of fast tankers had been very quickly emaciated by the bright idea fairies that came in after he was dead. But that happens. That happens. Anyway, let's consider the results of the operation I'm talking about. Ammunition expenditure in the attack at Talugi was high compared with results achieved, more particularly since there was practically no air opposition and very little anti-aircraft fire. In the light of subsequent knowledge, the results were even smaller than they were believed at the time. Damage to the enemy, estimated 2 destroyers sunk. Actual, 1 destroyer, Kikuzuki. 1 cargo ship, 4 gunboats and several barges. Estimated. Actual sunk. As said, 1 destroyer and 4 landing barges. Damaged. Estimated, a seaplane carrier and a cargo ship. Actual damaged. A mine layer, the Okinoshima, and a destroyer, the Yuzuki. Total expenditure was 22 torpedoes, 76,000 pound bombs, 82,665 rounds of machine gun ammunition, 5 Japanese single-float seaplanes operating from the Kyokawa Maru were shot down. The Americans lost 3 aircraft, in addition to the 2 fighters lost on Guadalcanal. 1 torpedo aircraft was forced to land in the sea and was lost, the crew being recovered later. Ammunition expenditure in the attack on Talugi was high compared with results achieved. If we compare it to contemporary operations carried out by the Fleet Air Arm, well, consider this. They launched 22 torpedoes and 76,000 pound bombs. That's more than were dropped at Taranto. So what's the thing? Is it that the American pilots aren't as well trained as the British ones? Nope, it's not. The British were warning the Americans about this, but it's because their torpedoes nosedived rather than belly flopped. So they got a lot of explosions in the seabed, which looked like they were hitting the ships, but weren't actually hitting anything. The torpedoes were running too low, they were hitting the water. Why did they do that? Well, as I've said before, lots of people have come up with the thing of, okay, we need to try and rebuoyant this end because it's too heavy, but it's going to be heavy anyway, so there's only so much buoyancy we can factor into there, so that it's going to be slightly inclined to nosedive anyway. Okay, so we attach fins, which are going to use the air power of the air it's travelling through, to help reduce the dive. You can do that, and that will get you some of the way there. The British had added on tension wire, tension cable, which just provides just enough force extra that it belly flops. Now, that is why you can make the case the Swordfish being the most advanced advanced torpedo bomber of its time, because it's the only one which could guarantee its torpedoes belly flopped every single time. If they didn't work, it wasn't because they'd entered the water wrong. They still didn't always work. I'm not saying that claiming they're perfect or they work or anything like that. I don't want anyone thinking that one. But it's literally, it's a tension wire, which means they are guaranteed to belly flop every single time. For the Americans, they don't. They have to work on their torpedoes still. And they do. They work on other ways to make them belly flop. They don't. The Americans are probably the best at developing what will later be the parachute deploy systems for torpedoes and various things to try and make sure they go in at the right angle into the water. And then they have to be completely reconfigured again for anti-submarine warfare. But we'll leave that to one side. That's an entirely different thing. And yeah, Nimitz cited the performance as an example of the manner in which proficiency drops off in wartime and necessity for target practice at every opportunity. Even Nimitz thought it was a bit low, the lack of hitting. It's interesting to note, though, the American commander is focusing on the training. The British analysis and results that came through for this was focusing on they're still not listening to us about the frigating tension wire. For Britain, the argument was you can't overcome with training what is dictated by the laws of physics. For the Americans, they believe they could, which is the kind of attitude you want. You want an undoubtable strength in your allies, but you also want them to have the ability to occasionally realize that maybe tech-wise they need to think things through. The first strike, the recon aircraft had commenced their dives at 19,000 feet, and the bombers from between 10 and 11,000 feet, which caused them to fog up their sights and windshields so that they could not be used, and, well, this meant you also needed to launch strikes from lower levels. The British were maybe less keen on this as a concept. Less keen on it as a concept, but it was certainly an idea. And from there, well, first off I need some iron brew, so I'm going to pause the recording for a second, and then I'm going to take you into the Battle of Midway. And we're going to talk about some of the details from that, starting off with the situation after the Battle of Coral Sea, and then we're going to talk about lessons and effects of the battle, which is something else the Royal Navy was very keen on reading about. Now, iron brew successfully acquired. Do love this stuff. Just the right amount of fizz. So, as said, page 109 next. Now, page 109 is the lovely section which starts off with situation after the Battle of Coral Sea. US inferiority in carriers. Which, again, sounds a rather strange one to be talking about, but it does make sense at this point. After the Battle of Coral Sea, the Americans found themselves in a serious situation in the Pacific. It is true that a valuable base for the reconquest of New Guinea had been saved for the Allies, and there were indications that the Japanese had temporarily at least renounced any designs they might have had on Australia. This was an interpretation which the Americans put on the absence from the southern waters of the Japanese warships other than their occasional submarines, and a husbanding of Japanese air strength so marked that during the weeks following the battle, the shore-based aircraft of the Allies delivered against enemy bases in Solomons, New Guinea, a total weight of attacks 2 or 3 times as heavy as those on the Japanese on Port Moresby and other Allied bases. But the victory had been dearly bought with the loss of 1 carrier and damage to a second, so severe as might require a considerable period of repair and possibly even a visit to the West Coast Navy Yard. In a region where the air was now clearly demonstrated to be of paramount importance, the Americans found themselves outnumbered in the Pacific as the fleet aircraft carriers by 2 to 1, with naval aircraft which the Battle of Coral Sea had shown to be inferior in performance to those of the enemy, and with screening forces insufficient in number to enable their battleships to be operated in support of their carriers. Again, it's interesting. The reports, when you're reading them from the Americans and things coming through at this point, is the reason the battleships aren't with them, especially the faster battleships that they have available, is because they don't have enough destroyers. This is, again, something which is really weird to imagine in the US Navy when we consider the horde of Fletchers and when they and all those things that they produce as the war goes on. But they're not available yet. And that's the problem. One of the interesting things you find as a historian when you're analysing history is a lot of people's perceptions of history are based on certain fixed points of time. And I have this debate with people sometimes about the American Navy, because we know about the big battles, but the impression of the American Navy is the American Navy in 1945, when it has oodles and oodles of resource at its disposal and to become the largest navy in the world. And the reality is, in 1941, that's not 1941, 1942. That's not the case. It's not there yet. It's coming. That force is coming down the slipways. It's coming, but it's not there yet. And so this is one of the things which I find strange sometimes when I'm talking about history, is because people have this image of the US Navy being so powerful because of what it is in 1945. But in 1941-42, they don't realise the real fear and trepidation caused by this sheer force imbalance being achieved by the Japanese, because whereas the Americans had a definite escort shortage at this point, the Japanese at this point were feeling rather comfortable with their escort numbers and were deploying quite large forces of ships out. Now, I've talked about these ships in other scenarios in their organisation, but we'll leave that to one side. Now, how the Americans dealt with all this, and how they dealt with the Midway scenario, is an interesting one, which I've done videos about. But in this case, in this scenario, we're going to go to the analysis, because there is an absolutely excellent section in this book of analysis of lessons and effects of the battle. And it is Chapter 8. It is 2 and a bit pages long, and it shouldn't really be as useful as it is. But again, what's interesting is reading the subtext as well as the text. Okay, that really does make things interesting. Experience gains. The Americans were not slow to recognize the lessons of the battle. Some of these concern materials, such as the inferiority of Navy fighter aircraft to the Japanese in speed, maneuverability, and rate of climb, the fatal inadequacy of the Douglas torpedo bomber, and necessity for developing long-range fighters to support the ground torpedo bomber, which was unable to attack ships defended by fighters. What's interesting about that one is, of course, when you consider that analysis, you consider that compared to the Royal Navy, which had basically decided that any attack on ships which involved fighters by a torpedo bomber was something which should only be undertaken in dark. Again, that's one of the reasons why the Royal Navy is as focused on night strikes as it is, because that's where it considers the safety for its aircraft and operations. The Americans had looked at it and gone, well, we need a long-range escort fighter for this job. Which is a pretty good, fair idea. It is a fair idea. But interestingly enough, the Americans had recognized this need earlier and had been working on this quite a lot. It's just trying to get the funding to come out of the various, how do I put this politely, bureaus of the Navy for it, and Congress. Midway and Coral Sea gave them the evidence to make the case for what they wanted. Whilst the aerial torpedo itself needed a larger warhead and to be designed for a much higher release speed. This is the other option for trying to make a torpedo belly flop. You see, if you've got enough forward momentum, then it's still moving forward at enough speed when it enters the water that it does a belly flop like that. It's the other option. The British had gone the tension wire route. Well, that worked for the British. But the Americans were going, okay, we need to make ours belly flop. We don't want to go the tension wire route because of the issues that gives you in terms of your speed, and it's fine if you're doing a night strike, but that's probably not sensible for us because we want to do strikes during the day. Okay, so it's got to be a higher speed, because if it's got a higher speed of entry, that forward momentum means that it's still got enough momentum coming forward to act as the extra force, like the tension wire does, to make it belly flop. as a sort of thing. And that was the helpful thing. That was what they were working on. US carrier task forces were reorganized to provide stronger close screens for cruise and destroyers, and consequence demonstrated the value of such a screen in torpedo attacks on the Yorktown. Nimitz considered that the Yorktown, had the Yorktown not been slowed down by previous bombing damage, she might have avoided all the torpedoes fired by the only 4 Japanese aircraft that succeeded in penetrating the screen. Nimitz always does have a bit of an optimistic streak. If you consider the British listing there, one of the interesting things is when you're listing 4 torpedoes that are fired by the only 4 Japanese aircraft that succeeded in penetrating the screen, the British will be looking at going, Yorktown is a treaty design carrier. Her torpedo defenses are not going to be great. Getting hit by 2 torpedoes is probably going to cause her enough trouble. If she, 1 torpedo in the right place would cause that problems. 2 torpedoes is critical. 4 torpedoes and expecting the ship to survive? If the 4 aircraft hadn't got through, that's another thing. That's another option. On the operational side, both Admiral Fletcher and Admiral Spruance stressed the vital importance of timing the first attack on enemy carriers, whilst the latter had their aircraft on board. Insofar as the Americans were able to do this, Midway was a victory of pre-battle intelligence, resulting in a tactical situation in their favour. Once battle was joined, however, there was a failure to maintain a continuous contact with the enemy, one cause of which was the unsuitability of the Navy patrol bombers for carrying out their important function of shadowing due to their inability to face fighter opposition. The lack of information on the enemy surface forces between 0623 hours and 1000 hours on the 4th of June was serious and jeopardised the tactical advantage we enjoyed over the enemy. Now, what's interesting to this is the British have been working pre-war, and we're still working on it in the war, on something which they called a fleet shadower aircraft, which was supposed to fly very high, be very quiet, have very long endurance, and basically watch the enemy fleet. You're supposed to shadow them, the fleet shadower aircraft. The British has sort of given up on that as option, as they thought it's probably easier for the enemy to design an aircraft fighter to come up and engage us than for us with current technology to keep trying to design something which can go even higher than the fighters can. It's just not practical. So what's your other option? Your other option would be that long-range fighter, which you were already talking about earlier. That could be quite useful. So you had a 2-seater version, or a long-range scout bomber. Something to keep track of the enemy. Now, the PBY is great for long-range patrols. But a PBY is not great for dealing with fighters. Not on its own. And that's, again, a problem. This is one of the things you find in the early months of the war, both for the British in 1939-1940 and the Americans in 1941-42. It's when pre-war doctrine meets the enemy action. And you have to start asking yourself, is it the doctrine that's wrong? Or is it the systems we've got implementing a doctrine that are wrong? And believe it or not, people are often happier to give up the systems than they are the doctrine. They are more wedded to the ideas than the systems. And sometimes they're right. Let's be honest, about half the time they are right. It is the systems, not the doctrine, that's the problem. But sometimes they're wrong. But the eagerness is always to try new systems first and think through the doctrine as whether it was a sensible doctrine. In this case, it is the systems, but there is doctrine issues also going on. The delay of the Enterprise's air group attacking against the enemy carriers and the failure of the Hornet scout bombers to make contact with the enemy can be attributed to this lack of information. Further loss of aircraft from the Hornet and Enterprise by water landings from lack of fuel can be partially attributed to the same cause. Here's where it gets really fun. The Japanese were guilty of the fatal omission to scout to the eastward of their striking force prior to launching their attack on Midway. Their planning having been based on the assumption that they need not fear the very thing that destroyed them, namely carrier air attack. There were two marked failures of coordination in US air attacks on the 4th of June. The first was apparently due to lack of time, not permitting adequate study and thought. On the morning of the 4th, all four groups of the Midway aircraft, the Army B-26s, the Navy torpedo aircraft, and the Marine dive bombers, though flown off at about the same time, attacked separately between 0710 hours and 0720 hours. Experience indicated that had they attacked together, there would have been greater likelihood of damaging the enemy. For the Royal Navy, writing that in any report is the equivalent of saying no ship, Sherlock. And to be honest, for the Americans, when they were writing in their reports, it's exactly the same. No ship, Sherlock. If we coordinate our aircraft better and they actually work together and arrive together, they're more likely to achieve the result we want them to do. Who'd have thunk it? Again, this is one of the early war situations where doctrine says work together. Everything says work together. Actually getting the groups to work together. The second instance, the failure to coordinate the carrier dive bombing and torpedo attacks between 0920 and 1025 hours, again as doctrine suggested they should be. Doctrine and planning said they were supposed to be coordinated. As had been so successfully done at the Battle of the Coral Sea a month earlier, as doctrine described, probably had little effect on the damage caused to the Japanese, though it resulted in loss of 35 out of 41 torpedo aircraft. The probably is doing a lot of lifting there. It's kind of going, well, yeah, the thing is, your torpedoes were not that good anyway, so the odds are, even if you don't lose 35 out of 41 torpedo bombers, they're not going to achieve much. It's kind of a damning indictment either way. It started off with going, your aerial torpedoes need to be designed so they actually don't run so deep, because they keep diving into the water and going below the enemy ships, or breaking up on impact. This is not good. They need to belly flop. And at the end, then it has this coup de grace here with, yeah, although, it had little effect on the damage caused to the Japanese, though it resulted in the loss of 35 out of 41 torpedo aircraft. And you sort of think, well, hang on, if the 35 torpedo aircraft, let's say it's only 10 lost rather than 35, that's an extra 25 torpedoes, surely that would have an impact. No, because of the torpedo issues. And by the way, I want to say this, if you want some real fun sometimes, look at some of the Royal Navy reports on their own operations. They are far ruder about themselves. They are far, far ruder about themselves. But again, the US Navy as well are far more polite about the Royal Navy than they are about themselves. And they're taking their analysis from Royal Navy reports and making them more polite, and the Royal Navy's taking their analysis from the US reports and being more polite about it as well. It's fun. They're having a polite battle of damning indictments. The escape of the Japanese main body and survivors of the striking force without being brought under attack by Task Force 16 dive bombers on the 5th of June, consequent on Rear Admiral Spruance standing to the eastward during the first part of the previous night, can certainly be attributed to the orders of the Commander-in-Chief US Fleet not to risk ships unduly, and to the fact that the Americans were defending a fixed point and had been warned against a probable enemy trap. Basically saying Spruance isn't to blame for that. We don't agree with Spruance's decision. We understand why, though. It's following his orders. Midway was the only defensive battle of the war in the Pacific in which American submarines were extensively employed. Lack of search radar for night shadowing was held to be the prime reason for failure. Directional SJ radar was installed on most submarines within a few months. Glad to hear there was a fix of it. And then there's effects of the battle. The Americans repulsed the attempted invasion of Midway at the cost of Yorktown and Harman sunk, and 307 men and 150 aircraft lost. The Japanese lost the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, and heavy cruiser Mikuma, whilst the heavy cruiser Magami, the destroyer Ashirishira, and the tanker Akebono Maru suffered major, and the destroyer Tamikaze minor damage. Losses of the Japanese officers and men were around about 3,500 and aircraft 253. The loss of 4 carriers, 215 naval aircraft, 100 pilots was crippling to the Japanese. The strike force with which they had achieved their conquests and on which they relied to repulse American attempts to counterattack was destroyed. Their shipbuilding capacity and air training organisation were too limited to enable them to make good their losses, with consequential effect on the future of operations throughout the war. This great American victory completely reversed the strategic situation in the Pacific. It put an end to the long period of Japanese offensive action, removed any threat to India, stopped the Japanese expansion to the east, and saved Midway Island as an important US outpost. It was perhaps the decisive battle of the war in the Pacific. Consider that rather a underplaying of it, but it's not wrong. It's not wrong at all. I would say also that what we're talking about in this scenario, and I do mean in this scenario, is, simply put, Midway is that battle where the Japanese plans of attrition warfare and of eventually maybe even a Kantai-Kessen go completely out of option, out of feasibility. From that point onwards, the Japanese have lost too much. They have lost too great a part of their force for it to be possible. And then we have 225, which is, and I do point to this, is where Leyte Gulf begins. And it's interesting to to note that Leyte Gulf goes from page 221 to pages 332. So it counts for roughly 110 pages in this work, which is more than, well, to be fair, any other by a long margin. In fact, it's more than the Coral Sea and Java Sea combined. It's more than the Battle of Midway and the Battle of Coral Sea combined. In fact, I'd say it's more than the Battle of Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal combined. So that shows you how much of a documentation, how much information was put into it. And again, you will find pages in here including notes on sources, lists of documents, this is the archive materials they've looked at, and the various analysis that's been done. It's really useful. It's a really good index of sources and index of information. It is really useful. So, organisation of Allied and enemy forces. In the autumn of 1944, the advance of the Allies in the Pacific had brought them to a line on which they stood over against the Philippine Islands, the pivot on which they planned to wheel northward and attack the Japanese mainland. In the southwest, General MacArthur's Allied troops and ships fighting their way northward from Australia and New Caledonia bases to Morotai and the Moluccas gained out possession of points from which amphibious forces could assault the Philippines. Further north, in the wide space of the Pacific, Admiral Nimitz's great striding drive westward, storming or bypassing one after another of the enemy strongholds in the Gilberts, Marshalls, Marianas, and Guam, reached in September 1944 the airfields of the West Carolines, and anchorages where his ships, supporting ships, could find replenishment and shelter. No breathing space was given to the enemy. From the support of the landings in the West Carolinas, the fast carriers of the Third Fleet returned to the Philippines. Consequent upon the revelation of the enemy's comparative weakness in the air during strikes early in September, an immediate decision had been made to advance by some weeks the date of the assault on the Philippines, and a landing on Leyte Island was planned for the 20th of October. The 21st and 22nd of September, under cover of bad weather, the carriers entered the waters to the eastward of Luzon and attacked Manila and the other targets. 2 days later, their aircraft were in the central Philippines, completing photographic coverage and reaching out as far as the Japanese anchorage at Coron Bay in the Calamianan group. After a short period spent in the replenishment and forward bases, the fast carrier task force recommenced on 9th of October the task of neutralizing as far as possible the 100 or more enemy airfields within striking distance of Leyte. Those airfields were too numerous to be effectively neutralised, and too close to Formosa and Japan to be cut off. Nevertheless, the preliminary operations apparently had the effect of enabling the landings at Leyte to be made without difficulty by the American troops. On 20th October, the operation for the recapture of the Philippines began. It goes forward. The Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Pacific Fleet's directives to the Commander of 3rd Fleet are shown in the Former's Operation Plan number S44, briefed as follows. The Joint Chiefs of Staff have directed that the C&C Pacific provides necessary fleet support to operations, including Leyte and Western Samoa, for the forces of the Southwest Pacific. Forces of Pacific Ocean areas will cover and support forces of Southwest Pacific. Western Pacific Task Forces, 3rd Fleet, will destroy enemy naval and air forces in or threatening the Philippines area and protect the air and sea communications along the Central Pacific axis. In case opportunity for destruction of major portions of the enemy fleet offers or can be created, such destruction becomes primarily the task of all Pacific Operational Area forces. Necessary measures for detailed coordination of operations between the Western Pacific Task Force and forces of the Southwest Pacific will be arranged by their respective commanders. All good? All good. Halsey's command consisted of 6 modern battleships, 8 large and 7 light aircraft carriers, a total complement of 987 aircraft, 6 heavy and 9 light cruisers, and 59 destroyers. Now this would be a varied organisation. It changes as time goes on, and as I've talked about in various other videos where I think that's the one about Leyte Gulf in terms of Admiral Lee doing a Nelson come out yet? Probably not. I think this one goes out before then. But that goes into the command structures quite a lot. In contrast, the Japanese forces... Well, the Japanese combined fleet was reorganised shortly before the Allied landing at Leyte. The 3rd Fleet comprised of 4 carriers and 2 converted battleships, Ise and Hyuga, with their screen, termed the main body of the Mobile Air Force or Attack Group. This fleet was based on Japan, and it was this fleet which, in the Battle for Leyte Gulf, constituted the Northern Force. Yes, the main body constituted the Northern Force. The majority of the remaining ships of the combined fleet were included in the 2nd Fleet, termed the 1st Diversion Attack Force, which was organised for the defence of the Philippines in 2 forces. The Southern Force, consisting of 2 old battleships and 1 heavy cruiser, with destroyer screen, and a Centre Force comprising the main surface fighting strength of the fleet. On account of shortage of oil in Japan, the home islands could not support the whole of the tactical forces, and the 2nd Fleet was consequently based on Singapore. Thank you, Royal Navy, your infrastructure was keeping the Japanese going. Yeah, we'll leave that to one side. The Royal Navy built infrastructure. Unfortunately, the defences for the infrastructure were not properly built, because someone decided to save some money. Someone had a bright idea. I am sometimes discussed by people as being considered to being anti-government. I'm not. Government is actually a useful thing. There are many useful things government can do, that you can do as a government that you can't do as an individual. And that is one of the reasons why we have them. But you cannot praise them for their good points if you do not point out when they make mistakes, because it's not honest. And the trouble is, most of the big problems and bad situations that have happened in history usually come down to a government somewhere along the lines having a bright idea about saving some money. This does not mean it's good to go off spending frivolously and spend on everything. That's not the argument you should take from that. The argument you should take from that is, if it's worthwhile building the infrastructure, if it's worthwhile building this thing anyway, then building the security for that infrastructure has also been worthwhile, because something which is worthwhile constructing is worthwhile protecting. And you don't save money by skimping on the latter when you've done the former. All you've done is put yourself in harm's way. Invested money in something you can no longer protect. Now it's interesting to consider the Japanese plan and the Japanese operations, and this is something which is quite a big part of this. The Japanese planned defense of the Philippines was part of the plan known as Shogo, or Show Operations. It was recognized that the defense of the archipelago could not succeed without the participation of the combined fleet. If the Philippines were lost, the southern shipping route, through which a trickle still ran, would be cut, and the fleet would consequently be immobilized to Japan for lack of oil, or if it remained in the south, cut off from its ammunition supply. Yes, if you want ammunition, you have to have supplies from Japan. If you want fuel, you have to have supplies from the south. That is your choice, and that is why the US Navy submarines were having quite such an enjoyable experience. The plan was designed to make the best use of Japanese strength in heavy surface ships, which at this date preponderated over their light force and naval air forces. Yes, the war had changed. The Japanese had gone from having a strength in terms of their air groups and their light surface forces to now them being the weakest of their strengths. In the event of the threat of the Philippines, it was intended that the southern center forces should advance from Linga Anchorage, about 100 miles south of Singapore, to Brunei Bay in Borneo, or the northern Philippines, and time their sortie from there so as to reach the threatened landing beach at the same time as the Allied invasion force, whilst endeavouring to avoid attack by the US fast carriers. They were to fight through any surface opposition and destroy the assault convoys. It's a wonderful plan. You know, why didn't I think of that? Just the simple, easy thing is to avoid being attacked by the American carriers. That's it. That everything will go right. Just avoid, because that's going to be something which you can do. Now, in theory, they shouldn't be able to. The fact that they do as well as they do at doing this is more an indictment of how well the Japanese managed to get inside Halsey's brain and deliver just the right information that he goes charging off where he thinks the enemy are going to be and misses where the enemy are. It still leads to the Battle of Surigao Strait, which is an absolute curb stomp. But it also leads to the Battle of Samar, which is a heroically brave action and something worthy of great praise, but shouldn't really have happened. Shouldn't really have happened. The plan of operations considered an attack from two directions on the invasion ships and supporting ships in the Leyte Gulf, with a diversion which it was hoped would draw off the powerful American covering force and facilitate the penetration of the Japanese attack to Leyte Gulf. This is the one thing, though. Sometimes your enemy's going to go right. Sometimes they are going to get lucky and they're going to achieve what they wanted to achieve. And it's an easy way is to blame the commander and go, you shouldn't have fallen for that well-laid trap of theirs. But they laid a trap, and they did it well. They laid a trap, and they did it well. But talking about the Battle of Samar, talking about it. Page 283. Is where it begins. In its official report, and this is actually on 284, at 15:12 on 24 October, Commander 3rd Fleet issued a dispatch which was intercepted by Commander 7th Fleet to all 3rd Fleet's and mortar commanders, stating that a force of battleships, cruisers and destroyers was being formed as Task Force 34, presumably to engage the Japanese Central Force. Commander Task Force 38 reported at 1852 that planes had sighted another Japanese force, hereafter referred to as Northern Force, in position 18 degrees 25 north, 125 degrees 28 east, course 270 degrees, speed 15 knots. At 2024, Commander in the 3rd Fleet advised Commander 7th Fleet to the enemy center force in position 12 degrees 45 north, 122 degrees 40 east at 1925 hours, was moving at a course of 120 degrees, speed 12 knots, in the Sibian Sea towards the northwest tip of Masbate Island, in the direction of San Bernardino Strait. He further stated he was proceeding north with 3 groups to attack the enemy carrier force at dawn. As the fast battleships had been removed from the carrier force groups and organised as Task Force 34, it was assumed Task Force 34 was still guarding San Bernardino Strait. Unfortunately, that actually hadn't happened. That hadn't happened. As I talk about in the Lee video, Task Force 34 actually hadn't been formed up. During the early hours of the 25th, it was borne in upon Vice Admiral Kincaid that there was no definite statement in Admiral Halsey's dispatches that Task Force 34 was still guarding San Bernardino Strait. The whole of his forces were now committed to the battle now in progress in the Surrey Strait. He decided to check definitively the position of Task Force 34. At 03:12 hours on the 25th, he made a signal to Admiral Halsey asking if he was guarding the strait. The latter apparently did not receive the signal until 06:48, more than 24 hours later, and when the reply was received, it was too late. The escort carriers were already fighting for their lives against the enemy which had fallen upon them from San Bernardino. The movements of the Japanese Centre Force had remained unreported since 21:45 hours on the 24th. In the first place, through the mischance of communication trouble, and secondly because with the withdrawal of the Independence night search aircraft, when this ship proceeded north with the 3rd Fleet at midnight 24th-25th, there remained in the southern area no aircraft equipped for night shadowing. I have to say, this is where it would have been really useful to have had a Royal Navy carrier around. And there was, believe it or not, some options where there could have been a British carrier from, assisting 7th Fleet. There were discussions about it at various points, because all the Royal Navy aircraft and all Royal Navy aircrew were trained for night operations, and all their aircraft, which were sort of bomber aircraft, were equipped for night shadowing. So it would have been useful to have had a Royal Navy aircraft carried out. And the reason for this, by the way, before anyone again starts thinking this is me saying Royal Navy better or US Navy not, no. You have to remember, US Navy hadn't built it in early into their program. They'd built other things into their program. One of the things I do think the US Navy does build it better is far more fighter training and far larger fighter forces earlier on, which is definitely a good route to go, and something which I do appreciate on them. The Royal Navy goes so heavily into night warfare because of, and I've said this before, it's excising one of its traumas from World War I. The Battle of Jutland, the Germans escaping at night. The British view on the night battle is that what they'd have done is they'd have used the night to attack the British. They'd have used the night to annihilate the British. To attack them, could use the night as a force levelling, because for the British it would have been far more difficult because they are far more numerous, so to be far more careful about blue on blue. Whereas the Germans could have attacked, but they didn't. Instead of breaking through. And it's kind of like, the British obsession with anti-submarine warfare. It's Abaco, Cressy and Hogue. That's why their cruisers are fitted with ASDIC and hydrophones and all sorts of things to allow them to detect torpedoes and to detect potentially submarines which are threatening them because of the loss of Abaco, Cressy and Hogue. And the Americans have their own traumas from World War I which they are working through in World War II. And one of those traumas is their lack of light cruisers. Their lack of fast modern cruisers. You just look at the sheer number of cruisers the Americans are churning out. You realise that's a legacy of their World War I experience, where they never had enough, and the treaty era is when they never had enough cruisers. The Americans are obsessed with building as many cruisers as they are because of that trauma. And that's the thing. Once you've lost where the enemy are, they can surprise you. Which leads us to page 331. Which is where we get to the ending analysis. It's a worthwhile read. The results of battle. Victory, but not annihilation. 5 days of coordinated fighting by American submarines, Allied surface vessels, and American aircraft had ended in a decisive defeat of the Japanese fleet, though not its destruction. Apart from its losses, 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, 8 or 9 destroyers, almost every important unit was damaged to a greater or lesser degree. so the fleet was crippled and henceforth became strictly auxiliary. For the Japanese Naval Air Force, the battle spelt disaster in the beginning and the end. It became a purely defensive force relying upon a weapon of despair, the suicide bomber, which had been tried out and achieved by surprise a single initial success in sinking the escort carrier St. Lo on 25th of October. This with a light carrier Princeton, a second escort carrier, the Gambier Bay, 2 destroyers, a destroyer escort, a motor torpedo boat, and a submarine constituted total and comparatively insignificant Allied losses in the 5 days fighting. The battle sealed the fate of the Philippines for a few weeks. Their land-based aircraft continued to give the Japanese control of the air over Leyte Gulf. Under this cover, they ran in a number of convoys of reinforcements, which enabled resistance to be prolonged, but any serious interruption of the Allied operations was henceforth out of the question. Nevertheless, the failure to destroy completely the Japanese fleet was to cost the Allies a vast effort in months to come. It was not until July the following year that the final seal was set upon the work that began at the Battle for Leyte Gulf. It's interesting to think that one. It's interesting to work it through. There were a lot of operations going on at this point, and there are a lot of things being fought through, but one of the things the British are looking at with the Americans is going, okay, so what can we learn from this? Same as the Americans when they're looking at the British. What can we learn from this? What can we learn from this so we don't have to lose our own people to it? And the thing that keeps coming through is less haste, more speed. That you need to be clear in your communications, and you need to keep up your communications. The entirety of the issues which you can look at in terms of the San Bernardino Strait and the whole stuff which comes from that in the Battle of Samar, if it hadn't been for the vagueness of the wording of Halsey's message, which meant that not just 7th Fleet, but Nimitz and King all believed he'd sent that force. All believed that there was a task group of battleships and cruisers and destroyers sitting off the San Bernardino Strait, and then there wasn't. That's an interesting problem to have communications-wise. It is an interesting problem to have communications-wise. And lessons of war are more important than attributing blame. You know, often I will see people focus on, we've got to find someone we can blame for this. And that's not necessarily the best option to take. Because if you're looking for someone to blame, you become focused on who's guilty, not the cumulative effect. Because, again, okay, Halsey's to blame for that decision, but so's his staff. And if you're not sure, considering how important the San Bernardino Strait is and how you don't have 9 aircraft to cover it, you should have sent a destroyer. You should have put a destroyer picket at least in the San Bernardino Strait. Kincaid or someone should have sent some destroyers up there. Because you trust, but you verify. And if you're not sure, you don't leave a gaping gap in your lines. You react. You react. And again, the senior officers as well should have been paying more attention. It goes up, the issues for that little operation, the things that go wrong, go up and go down. There are lots of different people who could have interceded and gone, hang on, has something been sorted out? Has something been done? With that being said, what's the question for today's video? What is the question? Well, I think there's 2. One, did you enjoy this sort of video, where I'm talking through a book and talking about its analysis and its contents? If you did, I might do some more, if you'd like them. There are plenty of other documentary books which would be suitable for this sort of thing, sitting on my shelf. Second question, the more normal question, is what lessons do you think other navies were taking from the operations of the Royal Navy and the US Navy? What do you think the Italians were thinking about when they saw what they were doing in the world? What do you think the Japanese was thinking when they saw what they were doing in the world? What was the analysis you think from their perspectives? Be interesting to hear what you think. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. I will now go to this and bring back the slideshow. Okay, what have we got coming up? Well, this video, if I'm not mistaken, goes out on the 23rd of September. Also originally scheduled for the 16th. And so next week we've got Collingwood after Trafalgar. That's going to be a fun one. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. Toodles. And if you like the video, please do like, share and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. Thank you. Thank you very much for watching.